Ivan Oransky, who I think probably needs no introduction. He's the editor of Retraction Watch, which I'm sure you all read and love, as I do. So thanks, Ivan.
Well, thanks very much. Always a pleasure to speak to people that we communicate with, sometimes in a slightly adversarial way, I suppose, but it's always good to have a conversation and dialogue. I was just checking, John said that one of the sort of goals, or maybe unspoken dreams, I think it was, of a journalist is to go to prison on behalf of an anonymous source. I will say that we protect our sources, and I suspect John and I have very, very similar approaches to anonymous sources, and some of you in the room either, for various reasons, know or suspect that, or we've made it clear. I will say, John, you need to move to New York because Massachusetts doesn't have a shield law, so I actually won't go to jail. I may have to go to court a little bit, but so I wanted to talk a little bit today. What I called this was Anatomy of a Retraction, and Alice sort of asked me to come up with some suggestion, other panelists to come up with some suggestions. So I'm going to kind of not really run through one retraction, but a number of them to give a little bit of a little potpourri of the sorts of things that Adam Marcus, my co-founder, and I have seen over the past not quite 4 years of Retraction Watch. So I'm going to start with a quiz, which I think you all will know the answer to. I have 5 different sort of hints, but I think you'll all know the answer within the first hint. These are euphemisms for something. One journal had a retraction that included the phrase unattributed overlap. It was not a dental journal. That would have been overbite. Another said this was an approach to writing. We thought that was sort of interesting and commendable in the one sense. Adam sort of thought, this particular act, which this is obviously a euphemism for, is an approach to writing the way showing up to a bank with a gun is an approach to banking. But be that as it may. You're all familiar in this room, of course, with the distinction between duplication and plagiarism. We often see this very clumsy is being kind, but it's really an inaccurate phrase, self-plagiarism, but that's, of course, referring to duplication. This sort of, in journal speaks, was, a duplicate of a paper that has already been published, which sounds as though the authors had just duplicated their own work, but in fact it turns out to be published by other authors, so it's still the other word. Significant originality issue. I like that. I trained in psychiatry. I got a little bit of I finished med school and got a little bit of the way into my psychiatry residency, so I thought maybe this was just a paper that needed a little bit more time in psychoanalysis, but maybe it had issues with its mother, but, and this, of course, gives away the answer, but also I think is a wonderful sort of summation of the sort of tiptoeing around that a lot of publishers, editors, journals go for here. Some sentences are directly taken from other papers, which could be viewed as a form of plagiarism. It could also be viewed as, maybe a form of plagiarism. So that last one at least gets credit for using the word, but in a very oblique way. And I obviously you all knew the answer as soon as I showed the very first example. But my point here is to demonstrate some of what Adam and I consider really sort of, if you will, walking around what's actually happening and sort of tiptoeing around it, or even I think John used the word obfuscating in a different sense, but really obfuscating what's happening. And it's no mystery what all of these are, but it's sort of just always, it's strange to us that this sort of happens all the time. We actually published, because somebody approached us and said, I love your euphemism for plagiarism posts. They sort of write themselves. I'd like to cite them, but you don't really have a central place. I said, yeah, So that actually prompted us to write a column. We have a column in a German newspaper called Lab Times. So we wrote a column where we gathered them, and that was only about 6 months ago. It's already out of date. I think we captured our top 10, sort of a la David Letterman, and now we probably could do another top 5 at least that we are friends of. So this, again, I don't know how easy, you certainly probably can't read the numbers. I'll give you the brief here. This, at least the trend, if not the actual chart, this is, I took a screenshot, but this is available at that website. Neil Saunders, who's in New Zealand, he's a bioinformatics researcher, actually puts this together based on retraction notices from PubMed. Again, no surprise to anyone in this room, what's actually happening here is a rise in retractions, and sort of we have every year now is a record-breaking year. This year, last year I should say, there were about 500 retractions. This year we seem to be on target for at least that many. And those of you who may know the history of just recent stories about that Nature broke about what happened at Springer and IEEE, there were about 120 retractions for, again, fake papers, SciGen produced papers. So we may actually boost the number because they're all going to happen this year, although I don't remember. I think IEEE decided not to call them retractions. Who knows? But anyway, the number is growing, and it's growing not just in sort of in parallel with the number of papers published, but actually in a dramatically larger way. So the number of retractions per paper published, the number of retractions was 10 in 2010 was 10 times the number in 2001. The number of papers published in 2010 was only 44% higher. So obviously there's I don't know which way I'm going here, but it sort of goes like that. There's a funny thing about this graph, which I keep meaning to tell Neil. That line is completely useless. It's something that Excel just does for you automatically. As these are the actual numbers. I mean, those of you who thought about that, the statistics of it for a second, know that you don't really need a sort of confidence interval on these numbers because they are the numbers, and yet Excel feels the need to put it in there. So anyway. That's a little bit of self-correction while I'm standing here, correction of somebody else. Another interesting thing to look at is how long those retractions take. And we actually had we circulated our thoughts and our slides in the last couple of weeks, and had some really interesting questions from my panelists, which we may get into during the Q&A, about what this slide means. And what this is showing is the time to retraction. And this was a paper by Grant Steen, who's, of course, written a lot of papers on the subject. And so, looking at, and there's a little bit of a dip, but basically this keeps going up, and that's up to, and this was, again, 2009, and this was a 2010 paper. So that's about 3 years from the time of publication. And I think it was Chris who pointed out in an email exchange, what would be really interesting is looking at time from initial allegation or complaint or what have you, and we'll get to those in a second, and time and retraction, because that would actually tell you sort of what the process is like. The time from from publication to retraction may reflect many, many things, like, for example, how many eyeballs are on the paper. We've seen, and so what Adam and I have seen, and this is really purely anecdotal, but hey, we're journalists, so the plural of anecdote is data. What we've seen is a sort of bimodal distribution recently. We see a lot of papers that seem to be retracted like that, and then we see a lot of papers. The current record holder, we like records. We're journalists because we like to sort of blow things up. The current record holder is 27 years. Paper took to get retracted, and it was for duplication, which wasn't, at the end of the day, wasn't really that interesting, but it was interesting because it took 27 years. So we're seeing this sort of bimodal distribution now, but again, I think we need to actually look at the data and see what that looks like. So, speaking of sort of retractions that take a while, this was a paper that many of you have probably heard of. Nature has sort of covered it extensively in its news pages. Others have as well. But this was a paper about basically dense symmetry and asymmetry. One of the authors of the paper, it was published in 2005, one of the authors of the paper had been trying to retract this paper since 2007. I mean, kept saying to Nature, this paper is flawed. He realized afterward, and one of his co-authors probably had done some things with the data he wasn't supposed to, but whatever the case, he'd been trying to retract it since 2007, and finally it was retracted in November of 2013. So there's a case where it took 6 years just for someone who actually asked for a paper to be retracted. More often, of course, it is authors fighting every which way to not get a paper retracted, which I'll talk about it also in a second. But again, these are outliers. We're journalists. I'm making fun of that, but the fact is these are just case studies and anecdotes. I'm picking on Nature. I'm sure there are people here from NPG, or maybe I'm not sure, but I know there's at least one former person from NPG because I spoke to him earlier. Nature can handle it. It's kind of like when we pick on Harvard. They can deal. I mean, they're pretty big and obviously quite prestigious. But this is a case actually that has sort of continued to be something we cover for various reasons. We got a hold of and by the way, like John, if you've got anything, many of you know this or have learned this maybe the hard way sometimes, but we do get access to things, but we can always use more access to things. So if you've got something, send it to us. We'll protect your anonymity. This was a case where we got a committee report from McGill. We didn't get it from McGill. It was a McGill committee report that said that some figures were, quote, intentionally contrived and falsified. Now, that's not really a euphemism. It is misconduct. It is fraud. And yet what happened was, and we have our sort of suspicions about why this happened, but Nature ended up, well, I'll show you what happened. So we get that, and this is long before anything runs in Nature. Nature runs a correction. Okay. A correction, it's sort of a complicated case, as many of these are, and it involves the fact that one of the images actually was from PNAS, or was duplicated in PNAS, with attribution, but that meant the PNAS paper was problematic. That got corrected as well. But here you have a case where something was intentionally contrived and falsified and only led to a correction. That doesn't exactly comport with, not to put COPE on the spot, but the COPE guidelines that's not really what you're supposed to do. And it's sort of not what science, I think, should be interested in doing. And I mean science with a lowercase s. Well, so then that correction got corrected again. Okay? Still not a retraction. So this happened just, I think this was a couple weeks ago. They corrected it, and they sort of had this longer, and they get longer with each one. We love this sort of phenomenon of a mega correction. We actually have a category on Retraction Watch of mega corrections, where there's literally a case, and Nature likes these, where every single figure in the image, every single figure in the paper was either miscropped, or it was flipped, or it was duplicated from somewhere else, and the correction went on for pages and pages and pages, and yet that was just a correction. So there's a case where, I'm calling it anatomy of retraction. It's actually not one. It's a correction. We actually, someone threatened to sue us once. We've had a handful of those. They're pretty comical. They're not real. But someone threatened to sue us once because we wrote about the fact that he had an expression of concern, 2 corrections, and a withdrawal. And he said, you're not allowed to write about that stuff because your website's called Retraction Watch. And we said, okay, we'll take that under advisement. Could you just, while we're thinking about it, could you let this newspaper called the New York Times know that New Jersey is not part of New York? I think one of the issues that a lot of publishers are, I think, and understandably grappling with is the notion of anonymity. And certainly publishers are very comfortable with anonymity in certain situations, but it's a sort of different kind of anonymity. Peer review, of course, we had Chris sort of talked about open peer review, but most post-peer review now is not. And so the editors obviously know who the people are, who the peer reviewers are, but the authors, or at least usually sort of, don't know who that is. Everybody seems to be asking people to raise their hands for some reason or other, take a picture, do a quiz. So how many of you are familiar with, or have heard from, I should say, or have gotten notes from Claire Francis? Wow, that's actually pretty small. I'm surprised. I don't know what the rest of you are doing, because he seems to be, maybe they go straight to spam at this point. He's certainly sending lots and lots of emails. Claire is, as some of you may know, an anonymous whistleblower. He's a pseudonymous, I think, is, I guess, the best way, most accurate way to depict him. It is a him, by the way. Adam and I have met him. We know a bit about who he is, not actually a tremendous amount. So we feel pretty strongly that anonymous whistleblowers are kind of just as good and sometimes better than people who name themselves. And I think that's a contentious thing. I know that not everyone agrees with us. One of the people who doesn't agree, but has a very thoughtful way of thinking about it, Eric Murphy's editor-in-chief of Lipids, and I won't read you his quote, but he just feels that we need to know who these people are. And Adam and I, honestly, in a perfect world, agree. When we write about things, we let people be anonymous, of course, all the time, but if they're making a factual, verifiable claim, we need to vet it. And that, to us, that's the distinction. It's not so much whether or not they're anonymous. But a lot of editors, and we're copied on, and if you didn't know this, you probably guessed it, but I'll make sure you do know it. If Claire's sending you an email, there's a really good chance that I'm BCC'd on it. So I guess, on the one hand, I shouldn't tell you that, because he's going to actually forward me your response too. But a lot of the responses, and again, I get it, we're all sort of we all get frustrated with various things, but they don't speak well of some of the folks who respond. Let's just put it that way. I briefly, I picked on Nature, so I guess I'll have to pick on Cell. This was a paper that came out, and really my reason for mentioning this particular paper, which came out about a year ago, and some of you may recall, this was about cloning human embryonic stem cells, sort of the first authors to do that. And this has now been replicated, which everyone figured it would be. PubPeer, which if you don't know PubPeer, I would urge you to know PubPeer, and again, may make you gnash your teeth because it's anonymous, but PubPeer.com, what happened within a few days of this paper being published, and this paper was published very rapidly in coordination with a conference, someone mentioned some potential image irregularities in this paper. And Cell, to their credit, very quickly said, yeah, you're right, something's happening. They told us and other people who asked that they were looking into it. And then this was a sort of second post we did, which said, they said that there were minor errors. But I want to, just to get back to this idea of a mega correction, there was then a 739-word correction involving most of the figures in the paper. Now, again, this is a paper that is held up, and that there's no, I suppose somebody might think that there's misconduct or something, but there's no evidence of misconduct in this paper. So it's not that this should have been retracted, but the question of sort of minor and major, they taught me in medical school. Everyone know the difference between minor surgery and major surgery? Right, so minor surgery is any surgery that happens on somebody else. Okay, I think 739, words with lots of figures. But my real point in mentioning this is that PubPeer has become a real force. I don't think that's arguable at this point. I was dubious, as I think a lot of people were at the beginning, but it's become really powerful. They've got all sorts of functionality. There was a case just recently, it happened about 2 weeks ago, where somebody raised some questions on PubPeer about a paper, and the author wrote back and said, you're right, and I'm going to retract the paper. So we contacted the author just to make sure that was really the person. It was, and that author in Japan said not only was she going to retract the paper, she told us, which we published, that she was going to lose her PhD because of it. And this is like no investigation. I didn't have to get anything leaked. It was all kind of right out there. So that's obviously a pretty extreme example, but PubPeer has become incredibly incredibly powerful. A lot of you may also be familiar with Paul Brooks, who was sort of outed as the proprietor of sciencefraud.org last year. And Paul did an interesting paper, actually, I was a reviewer on it, and I always disclose if I'm a reviewer. I think that as a journalist that's too important. I didn't end up actually going through with the review because I was concerned about the fact that the data couldn't be shared for pretty good reasons. This wasn't necessarily criticism, but just something I didn't feel comfortable reviewing. But in a nutshell, and this was available on PeerJ, Paul found that the papers that he had been sent, or the tips he had been sent and posted on, and again, his language, by his own admission, was pretty harsh sometimes and quite personal, and nothing that I think the researchers really liked, and he ended up getting shuttered for real legal threats. But the papers that he wrote about, that he posted on before his site got shut down, actually had a much higher chance, I think it was like 7 times the likelihood of being corrected or retracted, than the other tips that he got, which he sort of made the assumption, and he laid it all out, why he did this, where he got the tips but didn't post them on science fraud. So the implication, and this is very much correlation without even being close to causation, but the sort of his conclusion from that is that this can clearly having publicity of the scrutiny rather than just having it sort of quiet and often editors or journals ignoring it can really have an impact. So to close up, to conclude here, so we can get to Phil, some solutions which Alice asked me to ask us to come up with. I think like John, I like to sort of hopefully be a little thought-provoking but provocative. One thing that Adam and I struggle with is just thinking about, and people ask us this, we don't know what the right number of journals in the world is, and then probably there is no particularly right number, but we're struck by how many journals there are. and therefore how many days and years and of lives of peer reviewers are sort of taken up by reviewing all these in these pre-publication peer review journals. Can the world really sustain that? Is it reasonable to think that pre-publication peer review is going to be sort of at a granular enough level and sort of robust enough to do that? Embrace post-publication peer review won't be any surprise to anyone. We've written about this, but even without that, I mean, two guys who run Retraction Watch probably believe pretty strongly in post-publication peer review. Hire better lawyers. How many of you are lawyers in the room? Or, I shouldn't. Half my family's lawyers, but they still are a little embarrassed about it. When I say hire better lawyers, I'm sure that many of the attorneys that work at publishing houses are fantastic at being attorneys. What I'm sort of less impressed with is their sort of how consistent their values are with the values of openness and transparency. I'll just be blunt about that. And I think that a lot of what I showed you, obviously these are funny plagiarism euphemisms, but a lot of the other opaque and euphemistic retraction notices we see, if we don't know for a fact, we're pretty damn sure that it's because they have been sort of, run through lawyers who, are I guess, maybe more afraid of facing a lawsuit than of sort of doing what we think and what they probably think is the right thing. Subject for discussion, but there's certainly lots of great attorneys who have done lots of really, great muckraking work in publishing as well. So hire more of them. And finally, this is a big, broad, thing that no one's going to, solve in this session or many sessions. But scientific incentives have to change. And again, I don't think that's actually controversial. I think how to get there is controversial. The notion that a paper is sort of sacred and it's everything that counts for a researcher in terms of tenure and grants and promotions, that is, I think, leading to a lot of the problems we have, and we need to somehow break that a little bit. So with that, I'm done. Thank you.